Kate, are you
Hi
there?
everyone. Yeah, I am. Hi. So my name is Kate. I'm the Senior Advisor for Policy and Advocacy at Plan International Australia. And I'm based in regional Victoria on the east coast of Australia on Dja Dja Wurrung country.
Thanks, team. So we're all connected to each other because we've been involved in various projects that bring together academia and activism around feminist participatory action research. And we're always interested in sharing our learnings and our experiences of FPAR. Sometimes we're doing this work together, other times we're doing it with other people and other women's movements. And so we wanted to share the challenges and the joys of FPAR. So today's session will begin with talking about the theory of feminist participatory action research. We'll then present some case studies from each of us from our various areas of work. And we'll then have a discussion about the outcomes, issues and challenges of FPAR in practice. And there'll be a Q&A at the end for people to ask questions. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please put them into the chat and we will keep them in mind as we're going through the presentation. And there'll be 2 moments for questions. One is after we present our case studies and another at the end of the segment, at the end of the session. So I'll hand over to Trimita, who will start off by talking to us about the theory of FPAR.
Thanks, Naomi. So I'll briefly go over the theory because it can be quite long if you go into depth. So in short, FPAR is a conceptual and methodological framework, and it stems from participatory action research. And participatory action research has been done. It became popular around the 80s, and it already, it came out of a research process that aims to achieve social change, and it conducts research with people from oppressed groups. So in participatory action research, the concept of conscientization is important, where the citizens or these people who participate in the research process engage in critical dialogue and they try to understand the systemic injustice and also mobilize as activists. So that is the framework of PAR. And in the feminist PAR, we incorporate the feminist theory and we place attention on gendered and women's lived experiences and take that as a political choice. One important aspect of FPAR is looking at the process of knowledge production. So feminist scholars and researchers, they have been critical of the mainstream process of knowledge production, which often excludes women's voice and dismisses women's experience and so on. So FPAR acknowledges the influence of the hegemonic and patriarchal power over the production of knowledge, also data and expertise. So who are the experts of women's lives or women's issues, right? So in FPAR, we privilege the voices and the rights of grassroots women, and it particularly seeks to transform existing structures of patriarchal power. So the aim is to challenge the marginalization of women across their diversities. Another important aspect is to question the traditional power relationship between the researcher and the subject. And this has been challenged even in feminist research in the academia. So the democratic process of inquiry and action that is central to FPAR. And this deliberate shift in power helps us to have collective ownership of the knowledge and action. Yeah. So if you have any questions about it, please put it in the chat box. So essentially for us, FPAR is a way of doing feminist activism. So it adopts and strengthens collective activist processes and also incorporates democratic and inclusive decision-making along the process. So this is often not not seen in the traditional research practices. And FPAR also focuses on relationships and nurtures collective solidarity, which is also central to any feminist movement. And the intersectional feminist lens is also very important. So we incorporate that in the FPAR methodology. And you know, this approach helps us to honor women's diverse experiences and needs. So I mean, FPAR, in FPAR, we criticize the traditional research methods, and we also criticize feminist research methods as well. But FPAR itself also has criticisms, and so I have listed 3 here. And the first one is there's a perceived lack of credible professional approach when using participatory methodologies, especially with disadvantaged peoples, and it is often not recognized or accepted by the you know, academic or formal institutions. There is the risk of tokenistic application of participation. So we have seen that in some of the development practices where it becomes a checklist where participation means somebody just shows up, but it doesn't really address their agency or their ownership of the research. There are also ethical issues such as power imbalances. As in, it's a complicated process. So yeah, so we have to address power imbalances constantly, and that's not easy. And safety, because FPAR is political and it comes with certain risks. So it can expose the community we are engaging with to, you know, danger. So these are the criticisms of FPAR. I will now move on to talking about these 9 principles of FPAR that was developed by this feminist organization, regional organization called APWLD, or Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development. So these 9 principles sort of, they incorporate the practice of doing FPAR, and it becomes a very good checklist for us to check against, are we doing it right? So number 1 is the purpose of FPAR is structural change. When we say structural change, I mean, the big structure that we're trying to change as feminist activists is patriarchy. And some of the other pillars of patriarchy, APWLD addresses is globalization, fundamentalisms, and forms of militarisms. And one way to look at structural change would be if you change law, right? So that is a structure. Second one is amplifying women's voices. So it's important that we place women as the researchers and the authors of their story central to the research. So amplifying their voice and not, you know, going as a representative from outside of the community. FPAR is owned by the community. This is really important. This refers to decision making of the community along the process of the research, including design and conceptualization to, you know, execution and everything. FPAR takes an intersectional approach. So I mean, I explained that before already, but we do need to address that women are not homogeneous and there are diversity among women, and they have different experience of discrimination and privileges as well. Number 5 is if FPAR aims to shift power. I think this is one of the most important, central to any feminist work, to challenge power. So it is, we try to consciously reconstruct the traditional power imbalance between the researcher and the researched and all the other actors involved. So this is a point we need to revisit throughout the research cycle. 6, FPAR fosters movement building and collective action. So that is also something very important to check, that it's just not research for the sake of research and just knowledge production, but it leads to collective action. That's the action element. And 7 is that it builds capacity of all. So sometimes in traditional research, we think, oh, the researcher is the expert and they build capacities of others. But in this participatory approach, everybody's capacities are built. Everybody is learning something new. So that is also a conscious approach. FPAR involves free, prior, and informed consent. So that's a pretty standard principle. So it's really important to have that. And the last one is FPAR prioritizes safety, care, and solidarity. So I think this is the summary, and these 9 principles are applied throughout the research process. So I will now ask Naomi to talk about the research cycles and give us some examples of methods.
Thanks, Trimita. So feminist participatory action research follows a cyclical process of planning, acting, observing, and reflecting. And we do this in an ongoing and iterative way. So unlike, I guess, a traditional research process that may be quite linear, so you design your research, you collect your data, you analyse it, and then you report on it. In feminist participatory action research, we're consistently going through these cycles where collectively women working in partnership with researchers as co-researchers will plan whether it's their research or their action. They'll then implement that, they'll observe the experience of that and then reflect upon their learnings and use those learnings to inform their next cycle or their next stage of action and reflection. And we do this in many cycles, and this process is often really quite long. So an FPAR project, I would often argue, can be 5 to 10 years, whereas often research is quite limited these days by funding cycles that are quite short. But FPAR really looks at long-term processes of communities led by women generating knowledge together and then informing and implementing and reflecting upon action to bring about their human rights. So when we use feminist participatory action research, we use many different methods. If you don't mind just going to the next slide, Trimita. Thank you. So again, feminist participatory action research really prioritises creative expression and participatory ways of collecting and analysing data and then using that data to inform our activism. So we'll use methods that are quite interesting and inclusive, like drawings, photography and film, storytelling, performance, role play, and so on. These methods are very much focused on honouring that there are different forms of knowledge. And so we don't just use people sharing their, like talking in interviews or focus groups or filling out a survey as the only form of data. Women are documenting their expertise and their lived experiences in sharing what their lives are like and the changes they would like to see. These methods also really are very participatory and often don't require people to have strong literacy. And that means that they can be very inclusive methods. So things like this, the daily activity clock, or this one, the body and health mapping. This is an opportunity for women to reflect on and draw how a particular issue is affecting their lives and documenting that in a way collectively to then be able to see different people's different experiences and tell stories around that. This creative process also is done very well collectively because women can particularly work on the ground together. It's often quite fun and engaging, and it's a way of not only generating data, but then analysing that and comparing and telling stories and interpreting data collectively. So in FPAR, we collect data and we use that data to understand women's experiences in their lives and the issues that they want to understand and they want to document and generate knowledge about. And then women collectively use this knowledge to inform their activism. So this is a really crucial part of FPAR. We don't just collect data to then report on that. We collect data to generate knowledge to then inform the action that we need to take collectively to bring about the change to achieve women's human rights. And so actions that may occur within an FPAR process in these cycles of FPAR can be quite diverse. So it might involve, for example, community organising and perhaps unionising, women coming together to take action collectively and organise the strategies that they need together to achieve their rights. They might choose to use strategies like demonstrations or protests or even direct action to demand their rights. They may organise and engage in campaigning and lobbying and influencing with decision makers. Some particular other strategies may be things like petitions or letter writing or convening, bringing women together to share their experiences and then organise collectively. And of course, using the media to stand up for their rights and to share their experiences. So in an FPAR process, it is the research and the action that is integrated. And then when we're conducting action, we actually reflect upon that. So we can collect data during the activism phases as well, through this learning cycle and learning about what's effective and what we can use in the future to really inform effective ways of engaging with activism for women's rights. So now I think we're going to hand over to Trimita. So I'll hand over to Kate first, and she's going to introduce this next segment.
Cool, thanks Naomi. So yeah, we are going to move into the section where we're going to go through 3 different case studies. And this is really our chance to kind of start to apply some of that theory and demonstrate what it has looked like in practice in different projects that we've all worked on. And I guess because of that dynamic nature of the FPAR process that Trimita and Naomi have described, I think one of the things these case studies demonstrate is that there really isn't one way of doing FPAR. And in fact, there are many varied ways to implement the values and the principles of FPAR in different projects. So we're going to give you 3 examples of different projects from across the Asia Pacific region now. And I'll invite Trimita first, who's going to talk to us about APWLD's FPAR model. Thanks, Trimita.
Thanks, Kate. Thank you. I will briefly introduce the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development. So it's a leading network of feminist organizations and also individual feminist activists in Asia and the Pacific. It has presence in 27 countries in the region. So the mission of APWLD is to foster women's movements and influence laws, policies, and practices at both local, national, and also international levels to promote gender equality and women's human rights. So this is the organizational mission, and I will, through the case, will explain how APWLD uses the FPAR methodology to achieve its mission. So the premise is that APWLD believes that gender injustices and violation of women's human rights are caused by patriarchal systems, and patriarchal systems are supported by globalization, fundamentalisms, and militarism. So yeah, quite technical, but these processes create institutions that enable the violation of women's rights. And APWLD is also very strong at challenging the neoliberal development model and believes that this kind of development model of power and control exploits women and the environment for global corporate profit. So there is also a political belief. So the theory is that in order to change that, that big problem of patriarchy and that patriarchal system, and to achieve women's human rights, we need to create autonomous feminist movements, and we have to create enabling environment for them to work. And in order for feminist movements to sustain and thrive, they need support in these 4 areas that you see on the diagram. So they need to have, we need to build their capacities. Movements need to generate new knowledge, tools, and resources. They need to engage in advocacy. They need to have advocacy opportunities and engage in advocacy spaces. And also they need to have strengthen their movements or build new movements or have cross-movement solidarity in order to thrive. So with this theory in mind, APWLD applies the FPAR model. So the research, the aim of the FPAR is to achieve all of those big things. So how it's done is it provides sub-grants and resources to and 4 regional trainings and workshops. The length of the research period is 2 years, and in each round there are 8 to 12 partner organizations from Asia Pacific region, from the 27 countries that I mentioned. And one important aspect of this approach is that a young woman researcher is hired. So the sub-grant supports the salary of the young woman researcher to be employed for 2 years. This acknowledges the fact that lots of grassroots organizations don't have the capacity and resources to have somebody do full-time research. So the project supports it. And the mentor is also, who is usually a volunteer, is selected by the partner organizations over the, and they're committed for 2 years. And after the 2-year program, the women's movement, they continue their activism, and APWLD informally supports them, and sometimes there might be new opportunities that come about to support their activism, so that continues. So the process is, I'm going to walk you through the 12 stages. This is the 2-year, this captures the 2-year journey. So of course, the first one, there is a call for applications, and there's a selection process. There are organizational tools for that. The research team is then formed with a young woman researcher and mentor. And one important requirement is for either the young woman researcher or mentor to be part of the research community. Like they have to belong to the community, because that addresses that power relation between the researcher and the researched. And also there are language barriers and so on. And then the first training takes place. So we invite all of the 8 to 12 selected partner organizations to come, and then they're introduced to feminist theory and politics, and also research and organizing tools. One of the key tools that we introduce at the first training is called power mapping, where in the FPAR process, the team identifies all the potential actors that would be involved in the research, and what are the powers, and they analyze the power relations between the actors and which actors they want to influence through their activism. And then they go back to the community and do a pre-research consultation, discuss, set the agenda for the FPAR, and community members become co-researchers in the process. And then the research design is finalized together with the community and submitted to, for finalizing. And then there is a second training after the research design is finalized. In the second training, we build capacities on feminist facilitation and participatory research methods, and also data analysis. So this is really focused on the research aspect of it. And then they go back to the communities and undertake the participatory data collection analysis with the community, and then come back with the data and the initial findings in the third training. And in the third training, then we introduce some advocacy tools. One of them is digital storytelling. We also, go through some aspects of digital security and so on, and campaign tools. One of the key campaign tools that's been very effective is called critical path analysis. So, and it's also quite participatory and visual, and doesn't require a lot of literacy. So it's easy to use, and and you can use different papers and different materials to build it together. And then the research report is written, and then the campaign and advocacy and evidence-based advocacy plan is formed using the findings from the FPAR, and then they write the advocacy report, looking at how effective their work has been, what support they need. And in the end of the 2-year journey, there's a reflection meeting. That's the 4th meeting. And then everybody evaluates together how their FPAR was. And of course, if we can remember the action reflection cycle, the research cycle, that spiral process that can happen throughout any of these steps. So that takes place continuously throughout the process. So I was involved in APWLD between 2012 to 2019. And in that period, there were 8 rounds of FPAR. So that is over 80 communities. It's probably around 100, and across 20 countries. And each of these rounds had different thematic focus around land and resources. There's climate justice, FPAR, labor, migration, trade justice, and so on. So I'll give you one quick example of one of the 80 that I'm talking about is the Burmese Women's Union. And this FPAR took place between 2015 and 17. So basically in Myanmar, 90% of the garment factory workers are women. So through the FPAR, 65 women workers from 15 garment factories from 3 industrial zones in Yangon, undertook this FPAR. You can see them in the pictures. And using their findings, this is the action, like very, very powerful actions that they took. So I will just walk you quickly through. So they organized protests and organized the union. They were not paid, and their key issue was that the women they had very poor working conditions, and the wage is very, very low. It's below minimum wage. And also they had worked and they were not paid. So there was a back pay pending. So their organizing and protesting led to, firing of this union leader, and the protest led to shutdown of the factory which produces clothes for H&M. And then they had meetings with governments because they wanted to influence the law, the minimum wage law in Myanmar. So they had meetings with other governments in country, with the embassies, Japan, Sweden, US, Norway, to influence that law. And they received support. They actually received positive support from this, if I remember correctly. They also used the digital storytelling training to produce this documentary. So it's put the link, so have a look. It's very well made. And they highlighted the issues of insufficient salaries, social security, health, and working hours. They launched this documentary, and they invited all the actors, journalists, media, and took on this rigorous campaign. And this led to media coverage in a Swedish magazine. So this magazine was actually following this case of the workers' rights issue in Myanmar, and already they confronted H&M back in 2015. And after this research was done, and he had this journalist Axel Kronholm had all this evidence, he covered the story saying, oh, 2 years later, we found the same problem H&M is not capable of addressing. So he confronted H&M again. And it led to a response from H&M, where H&M actually committed to follow the national legislation and ILO conventions, and promised that they are going to address those issues. So this is my case. So you can see that throughout the 2-year journey, how using the methodology, it was like the organizational mission is to strengthen the movement, build capacities. So all of this was happening throughout the process. Thank you. So I would like to now invite Naomi to share her case from Edith Cowan University, the Climate Justice Research Program.
Thanks, Trimita. So I'm a research fellow at Edith Cowan University, and I focus on climate justice using feminist participatory action research in partnership with women's rights organisations, women activists and rights organisations. Trim, would you mind going to the next slide? Thank you. So I feel extremely privileged to have a 3-year research fellowship that's funded by my university, that I can use FPAR to work in partnership with the movements to strengthen their capacity of universities, of government and civil society in WA, Western Australia, in Australia and the Asia Pacific, to promote climate justice at all levels. So the university has funded me to do this work in partnership with movements. And so I'm working across 3 areas. I've formed an interdisciplinary research group, and now actually a centre within my university with other researchers who are active in the space of human-environment interaction. And I specifically bring this climate justice lens, and very much bringing the methodology of FPAR to work in partnership with other researchers to make sure that our research is impactful and that it works in partnership with movements. I'm also engaging a number of FPAR studies in partnership with organisations and social movements in Australia and in the Asia Pacific, including APWLD, who Trimita talked about earlier, and PLAN, who Kate will talk about after this. And as part of my fellowship, I also have a great student network. So I have some PhD students who are also doing FPAR, either within my projects or their own sub-project. And I also have social work students who work with me doing their social work placement, where they also become part of the research team as co-researchers and are supporting the rolling out of FPAR in partnership with movements. So I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that I'm doing here in Australia. And both of these projects are ongoing, so they're not completed. So rather, I'm going to share the current work and the experience of FPAR and I guess the motivational drive behind these projects. So the first project is a project around mainstreaming gender in activism for climate justice in Australia. Now, the premise for this FPAR project is that the Australian climate movement, including climate justice activists in Australia, generally lack a gendered lens in their activism, and they often overlook issues of gender inequality and further intersectionality. And so the aim of this project is to identify effective ways to promote gender-responsive activism for climate justice in the Australian climate movement. And so the FPAR process that we're undertaking is there's a collective of activists across feminist organisations and climate organisations, unions, queer and organisations for people of colour. And we've come together to design this project together for how we can essentially have an intervention in the movement to promote intersectionality and to really engage in consciousness raising strategies to strengthen the knowledge and action for climate justice activists. And so this is focused on helping them, activists, to build their understanding of gender, intersectionality and climate justice, and also develop and implement actions to mainstream gender in their activism. And this is very much, because the project is being conducted by activists for activists, it's very much this collective participatory process. If you don't mind just going to the next slide, thank you. So what we've done is we designed collectively a consciousness raising program with climate justice activists. Now, we commenced this program earlier in 2020, and the intention was to be rolling out a series of face-to-face workshops, consciousness raising workshops with activists in Western Australia and in Victoria, so 2 different states of Australia. Then COVID happened and we had to change and redesign the project. And so we've run this entire program of the whole of last year online with a series of workshops with activists online to engage in dialogue about these topics and to really explore what intersectionality and climate justice mean. So the first training session looks at power, colonialism and resistance, and understanding the systems of power and how they relate to climate justice. So it's different from climate change or climate action because it's very much around how the systems of power and injustice relate to climate change. We then support activists to understand and to interrogate intersectionality and what that means in the context of climate change. And then we look at gender just climate solutions and what it means to work from a gender just perspective around climate action and climate justice. And then the next stage is then shifting into activism for climate justice in Australia and supporting activists to understand how we can be working from an intersectional lens and from a feminist lens in engaging in activism. And so as part of this training and consciousness raising program, activists then collectively design action plans with other activists in their collectives. And then they use these action plans to implement actions within their activism together to enhance their activism. So we're at the stage now of we're analysing some of the data that we've collected through each of these workshops, but equally the activists themselves are implementing these actions in their work. The second project that I'm involved in looks at climate justice in the West Australian community sector. And again, this commenced in 2019. Now, this study is founded on an understanding from some research that community service organisations in Australia want to prepare and adapt to climate change, but that they require tools to adapt and to prepare for the realities of climate change for communities they're working with. And so the aim of this project is to strengthen the knowledge, capacity and action of community sector organisations in Western Australia to facilitate climate justice. I've been working collectively with community sector organisations to examine the social justice impacts of climate change with their communities and clients, and then collectively develop and implement strategies to support them to mainstream climate justice in their work and that they can undertake collective action together. So the first cycle of this research, thanks, Trimita. Yeah, the first cycle of this FPAR project was undertaking some research within the sector itself. And that was to understand really where the sector's at in understanding the relationship between social justice and climate change. So we collectively designed some surveys, interviews and workshops, and then undertook these with community sector representatives. And what we found in this process is that generally the community sector organisations have a fairly low understanding of the relationship between climate change and social justice, and that they often lack policies and procedures to address these issues in their work. And so building on these findings, what we did was that we then decided collectively that the action we wanted to take was to develop a climate justice toolkit. And so for the past 6 months, I've been working with community sector organisations to develop and then to implement an online toolkit for organisations with a whole range of tools to support them to mainstream climate justice in their work. And so this toolkit will be available online and launched hopefully sometime this year. And it'll provide a whole range of practical tools that organisations can implement, whether it's around governance or around policies and procedures, how they deliver services in a climate changed environment, engaging in advocacy and campaigning around climate justice, and of course, reducing your footprint as an organisation. And so this project is undertaken as a researcher in partnership with community organisations through an advisory group, through people with lived experiences of climate injustice, and then also with social work and digital security students who are engaging in partnership with me to implement the project. So these are just a couple of examples of FPAR that I'm integrating in my work as an academic. Thank you. I'll now ask Kate to share her experiences.
Thanks, Naomi. So I'm going to be talking about a particular project that happened last year as a result of COVID, but just to kind of preface it by saying that Plan International comes at FPAR from the perspective of being really committed to youth-led research and advocacy. And because of our focus on community development, on structural change through advocacy and influencing, and on gender justice, we were really drawn to FPAR as an approach that we could use and apply with girls and young women in the countries where we work to identify the issues that they face, but also to kind of collaborate with them to come up with the solutions that they want to see, to then advocate for change. And so I was going to be presenting today on a Pacific climate change project that Naomi and Trim and I are working on together, but because of COVID last year, that was paused. So hopefully we'll have an opportunity to talk about that at another conference perhaps. But what I'm going to talk about today is what I would call a rapid FPAR, which is our Better Normal project, which was a quick pivot during the very early days of COVID. It was our first time of trying a youth-led FPAR online, and we conducted this across 2 countries, so between Australia and Vietnam. And so I'd just like to quickly acknowledge my colleagues Talia Clark in Australia and Phonan and Hugh Van Tran in Vietnam, among many others who helped collaborate, co-facilitate and joined in just at different parts of this project. So in terms of the premise, it was the beginning of COVID. We weren't sure how long the pandemic was going to last. We were having to pause projects. We were trying to find ways to connect with people during the sudden shift online. And we were also trying to think of ways that we could research and document the pandemic as well, and the impact that it was having on girls and young women. So our global research team decided that they would start a longitudinal study focusing on the impacts of COVID, but we were also hearing from our youth activists networks that they wanted to find some hope in this crisis, and they were really kind of struggling to see a way through, and that they were really inspired by takes on the pandemic as being like a portal moment by Arundhati Roy, or seeing the crisis as a moment to stitch a new garment, for example, and things like this, the illustration that you can see on the screen here. So we talked with our youth activists about it, and they loved the idea of presenting ideas for change to not just recover from the pandemic, but to build back better, or to create a better normal. So we decided to create a complementary FPAR that would work with the Global Research Team's project, that would move from the impacts to vision and ideas for change in action. So because of the core of this project being about envisaging something new, the method that we chose was appreciative inquiry, because of it being possibility oriented and envisioning the best of what is to look at what could be. So you can see the 5 steps in the cycle on the screen there. And we worked through those across a period of about 4 months. So the first part of that process was, first of all, actually working out how we were going to do this. So on the next slide, Jim, we can see that we've got 2 countries working together in a kind of hybrid way. So in Vietnam, it was possible to do in-person workshops. So in Hanoi, we zoomed in as co-facilitators from Australia. The girls were in the workshop together, and we also trained some of the program facilitators to deliver workshops with girls in rural areas as well. And then in Australia, on the next slide, we can see all of the youth activists joining online workshops, which meant that we had to learn really quickly how to do all the activities in a really fun and interactive online format that we use Miro and Mentimeter and Zoom and other things for. So the first step in the appreciative inquiry process was to define the topic. So to get to the research question, we started with the premise and then used virtual or real sticky notes to write thoughts on phrasing, what to include and so on. And the youth activists basically worked out that they wanted to divide it into these 3 sections of the past, the present and the future. Then the discover stage was done via the mind map that you saw earlier, which took a range of headings of known impacts of COVID on girls, such as education and health and other areas. And then there were 2 sides on the mind map, one for appreciations and one for challenges. And they could add to the mind map new thematic areas, as well as adding what those impacts look like in reality. So for example, one of the positives of learning during COVID was greater access to global trainings and webinars. But one of the challenges was the digital gender divide, which saw girls without access to internet becoming more disadvantaged. So then using the insights that were gained from this Discover activity, we took them through a guided imagery, which got the youth activists to project themselves into the future, kind of like a day in the life of the world post-COVID. And they could journal their visions in the way that best suited them. So some of them wrote them down, some of them drew them, like you can see there. Some of them recorded their spoken vision, some of them created songs. There was a whole range of methods that were chosen. And then they worked in small groups to see what points of resonance and connection there were between the individual visions to create small group vision statements. And then that led to creating one collective vision statement across the 2 countries, which is the one that you can see here. And I really feel like it was at this point in the process where we really began to see it coming to life, with the youth co-researchers really coming up with ideas and shaping their data themselves. So for example, they felt that there were some common themes in their small group visions that were really important expansions on that big overarching vision. And so they created 6 pillars, which you can see here. And each of those have their own individual vision statements that you can see in the report if you're interested to see that those expanded versions. And then they also kind of said, you know what, we know that we were going to keep this as a 2-country study, but we really want to see if our vision resonates with other girls and young women around the world. And, you know, we're doing this mainly digitally, like maybe we can find a way to do that. And so they self-organized into groups to co-design a survey, which they then custom built a website for, so that it was really engaging and interactive and could be available in multiple languages. There was an illustration group, so all of the beautiful illustrations you can see throughout these slides came from them. They made a SurveyMonkey version of the survey for low resource settings and a Word document booklet as well that could be printed and used by Plan International program staff in no internet settings. And they also trained themselves as peer interviewers to deliver focus groups. So this resulted in hearing from girls and young women from 99 countries around the world, which was pretty amazing. They were all really stoked about that. And then we went through another cycle where we moved into the deliver part of the process. And again, this is where the youth co-researchers self-organised into groups to collectively analyse the data, to conduct a policy analysis. So they were paired with policy experts to develop the recommendations that were related to their ideas for change. And they also had a co-author group, so they co-authored the report. And then from there, we moved to mapping out opportunities for change. So how could we take the findings and the recommendations into different spaces where they could start to influence that at that structural change level? So we worked with plan officers around the world to identify different influencing moments, which ended up with them delivering an intergenerational dialogue at the United Nations General Assembly and a Geneva event as well. They worked with our media team to deliver opinion pieces, to present on TV shows, that kind of thing. They worked with our campaigns team to develop a solidarity campaign, which was basically an open letter that people could sign to show their support for the girls' vision and recommendations, and that was officially handed over at the UN event. And they leveraged off their own networks as well and presented at multiple webinars and communities of practice and so on, so that others could be inspired and take up some of the action work themselves and integrate it into the things that they were doing. So just to end on saying that we're now in the next iteration of the research cycle for the deliver phase. So we're going to continue identifying new opportunities, things that are arising because of the work that they've already done and taking us down different tracks. And for example, at the moment, we're doing a deep dive into the educated citizens of the world pillar. And yeah, that's exciting to see kind of all of these spin-off projects now that are kind of happening because of this one core project. So I'll leave it there and hand back over to Naomi.
So perhaps before we go into our discussion now about between the three of us around FPAR in practice, I wonder if anyone who's participating or attending the workshop has any questions that they'd like to ask around any of these three cases. You can just speak if you'd like. Perhaps we can just not share the screen for a little while, Trim, and just see if anyone has any quick questions. If you want to ask a question, you can put your video on or just raise the hand function. Okay, well, we'll go into our discussion then. Thank you, Trim. So what we wanted to do for this next part of our panel was actually to have, I guess, a bit of a discussion between the three of us about our experiences of feminist participatory action research and some of the challenges that we might experience and I guess the interesting and learnings that we've had through, for some of us, you know, several years of engaging in FPAR. So one of the key parts is that we really argue that FPAR is a methodology of activism for structural change. And one of the questions we're often asked is, well, what does action look like in FPAR? And how do we ensure this ongoing cycling of action and reflection? So I might ask Trimita firstly to talk about what does action for structural change look like in the small scale FPAR projects that APWD engages with and their partners.
Right, so because the FPARs in the APWD FPARs are always focusing around structural change, and structural change is not, it's very difficult. When you say structural change, let's say we want to change a law that doesn't give, you know, that prevents women from inheriting land, for example, right? That's very common in Asia. And you want to change that law. It's not possible to change that in 2 years. Changing a law often takes a decade, right? So I think action would be to continue that. So the 2-year FPAR that we do is just sowing the seed for activism. But the activism needs to continue beyond the 2 years. And we need to find resources and support so the activism can continue. Some other examples in the region would be not even changing the law anymore, but because of the rise of the authoritarian governance, a lot of it is resistance related. So we would see a lot of corporate infrastructure projects that are displacing communities, and it impacts women disproportionately. So for example, in Cambodia, in Vietnam, we would see like large scale dam projects, for example, building hydropower dam. So the FPAR leads to activism to stop that. Or a geothermal project in Philippines, so the women had to take direct action, submit petition to stop the geothermal project from taking over their land. So yeah, so activism would be when the women take the agency, to own the research and the findings, document their own stories. They understand the root causes and the structural issues of injustices, and then they decide how they want to change the situation.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Trim. And what about plans context, Kate? How does that look in terms of supporting young women and girls to take action? because that's quite a challenging demographic, I guess. And, you know, there's a lot of complexities with working with girls. So, yeah, what's your experience?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of the reason why we focus, like Trim mentioned earlier, that principle of privileging the voices of grassroots women. And for us, it's really kind of looking at the intersection of age and gender and saying, you know, we have a specific focus on girls and young women because we see that they often fall through the cracks of either working with youth as a homogenous cohort or with women. And so there's a need to kind of have a space for them specifically, and also because they're at a really unique developmental stage and so on. So we tend to work through our youth activist networks, which is a great way of kind of having a group of dedicated young people who are going through a leadership course for generally for a 12-month period, but then they often stay on as alumni and kind of carry on and being engaged with our projects. And I think, you know, one of the things that I've really enjoyed seeing in doing a range of different FPAR projects over the last kind of 2 to 3 years is the development of how we support them through that process and what it means for them and how it's becoming more and more youth-led, essentially. So I think, for example, we've really worked well with girls and young women as co-researchers. And looked at how we can integrate and adapt our influencing and campaigning methods to be more youth-led also as part of the FPAR process and to stay true to the values and principles. So for example, where before normally the action part of FPAR, like we would do that in-house, we would have like stakeholder mapping activities and, you know, we would do that all as a campaigns team and an advocacy team, whereas now it's really about collaborating with our youth activists and going through these FPAR cycles to do that together. And I think, you know, the results are so much stronger. And I mean, there's so many reasons why that would be true, but it's really amazing to see that in practice. But yeah, like you say, there's also challenges to that. So I think, you know, working with minors is obviously one of the key ethical challenges, really walking that line between the rights of the child and the young person to be heard and to participate in decisions about their lives, but also holding our duty of care to them. And so, I mean, there's a number of different ways that we kind of walk that line, but I think it's important to note that that is something that comes up with working with a cohort that we're working with.
Yeah, I think the other noticeable thing is that because the research cycle is not cyclical, not linear, right? So the action actually happens from the beginning. Small actions are happening even throughout. So, I mean, building capacity itself is an action by the women, right? They identify what kind of capacities they need in order for strengthening their activism. And you know, they are the ones who identify, so who do we need to engage and so on. So they're taking actions throughout the research cycle and also planning throughout. So I think that is the beauty of FPAR, the action reflection and the flexibility of fixing it's not rigid, right? Yeah. The other, I think, strong action we're seeing is like women, because, you know, because of the region, the Asia Pacific, and it's seen as the global South, and there is this power relation between the global Northern countries and the global South countries. It's the developed country, rich countries versus poor countries. From that lens, we are seeing women becoming more unionized in the region and seeing the power of unions because women's workers' rights are under threat. So that's another form of activism. I think even very small unions, that's happening. And yeah, I think the structural change, we say law, but sometimes it is really some of the traditional cultural practices that can be harmful to women, right? And that challenge, I mean, that kind of change in the society, or even a small change in the community where women can now go out to work, these are big changes for their lives. Yeah. So I was wondering, Naomi, in my because my entry to the academic space is, you know, like I entered late, because I've been, you know, for the last decade I've been involved in the feminist activisms in Asia. So activists are often very critical of the academia, right? And you can see that sometimes there is visible resistance to involving academic people in the community projects. So I was wondering, what role do you think the academia can play in supporting or or building social movements? Because you have been doing it, so I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah, and I really describe myself as an activist researcher, or, you know, a pracademic. I always feel a bit uncomfortable with kind of boxing myself into the academic space, because I am an activist. I'm doing a lot of grassroots activism within and outside of my academic work. And, you know, I think this kind of critical analysis of really thinking deeply about academia and our role and our purpose in movements is really vital. I think that as academics, that we have a strong responsibility for ensuring that the knowledge that we generate and the knowledge that we're part of, you know, I guess forming or communicating, that it's part of the process of social change. I think that a lot of the time we've had like research being conducted, published in a journal that often only the elite can access because of the way that journals are, you know, closed to those that subscribe and so on. And we're often communicating with each other about our research findings. And the next step is what's really vital is actually using that to be part of the process of social change. So I guess how I see FPAR and the role of academia is us being, I guess, a resource that movements can call upon, that they can engage and they can use to strengthen the work that they're doing. And this really sees us as at the service of the movement, or as a participant in the movement, as an activist in the movement, where we can enable, we can support, we can train, we can share our expertise and our knowledge and support the social movements to develop the actions that they want to take, and you really draw on us to be able to undertake the research they need to bring about the change they're working towards. So, you know, this really requires us to work in partnership with community organisations and with social movements. And it also requires us really to shift from that position of us thinking of ourselves as experts, and instead understanding that we are co-researchers and we're members of the movement with the people that we're working with. And often, actually, we don't really have the expertise, that the communities understand their lives and their needs much better than we do often, and that our resources, what we can draw on, whether it's funding, whether it's, you know, our research expertise or so on, we can use that to support the movements and communities to do the work they need to do and that they want to do. So we really, I think, are quite responsive to communities. We also bring, I think, to FPAR and to community work, community-based research, obviously a strong understanding of research ethics and around methods, in particular research, participatory methods and participatory analysis. And so again, I think we can really support movements by training and helping people to really understand and demystify what participatory research looks like, so that they can actually lead this in their own communities and use that themselves. So my experience has been, as an activist researcher, working using FPAR in partnership with communities is extremely rewarding, and also I think takes my research in places far beyond the ivory tower of academia. And you know, that's very, I guess it's very invigorating for me as an activist. Oh, I think you're muted, Trim.
I think it's not very common for the academics to take on this particular methodology. There are very few because it works, I think, in communities best, the FPAR methods. And so usually it would be led by an NGO or nonprofit organization, right? And often with partnership with academic institutions. I mean, from my experience, I think the support from formal institutions would be what would be most valuable, even for the organization, the community organization, would be the technical aspects of it. And remember, we were talking about the criticisms of FPAR, where when it's done by community, there are some standards that we are not aware of, and then sometimes it doesn't get accepted everywhere. So I think the role of academia can also be like supporting how to make the research output acceptable, and have that technique, provide the support for technical capacity building. My question is to Kate. So what do you think are the programmatic challenges like working in Plan International of doing FPAR in a non-research institution? Because Plan does all this other work, right? Yeah, research is not the focus, and so is FPWLD, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, it's a little bit boring and technical, but basically I think the main challenge is just that there's so many different departments that do aspects of FPAR work. So like we have a research team, we have a policy and advocacy team, we have a campaigns team, we have a media team, we have programs teams, and all of them kind of need to come in at different parts of this process to make it work. But obviously you still also need someone who's overseeing the whole thing and can bring everyone together. So I think that has been challenging right at the beginning, just kind of understanding actually what is this approach, why are we doing it, how do we need to work together to make this happen and be a really positive process for everybody involved. And I think really it's only in doing a few cycles of it that people have seen the power in it essentially, and then the reasons for collaborating and for kind of, jointly doing this work. So I think that's kind of one of the main things from one of the individuals who often is that convener of all of those different groups. It's just getting people in the room and getting everyone on board as well with the vision, because I think there's different drivers to all of our work, right? So it's like, if we're all grouped around the desire to amplify girls and young women's voices and experiences, as well as to create structural change, that's a really great thing to bring us together. But we're also all motivated by different things, like whether it's localization in research or getting media hits, or like whatever the other things are that we have to meet. So it's also figuring out how we can bring everyone together and what that kind of central focus is going to be. And then I think there's also just working with the youth activists and hearing from them, what they want this process to be, how much they want it to be completely youth-led, like what they see our role as co-researchers in the process being, what they see as our expertise and what they want us to bring to the capacity building side of things, but also what we can learn from them and where they're going to be, teaching us in so many different ways. So I think it's really interesting to kind of switch from maybe a previous way of thinking about doing things, where it was very much like we have this amazing youth activist network, but we're kind of very much guiding and directing where that goes and what they do, to then this much more collaborative co-research model.
It's been interesting for me observing APWD and the way that they bring the different departments or areas of the Secretariat into the FPAR processes for the grassroots communities. And I really appreciate it, because you'll have a small, like a young women researcher and their mentor from a remote village in India, undertaking their research and campaigning, and they may, want to draw on, say, some media advice from APWD or some digital design work that then they can use in their grassroots work. And that sort of resource, to have that available for grassroots women's organisations and groups as they undertake FPAR, is quite extraordinary. And when they come for their regional trainings as well, the women in the Secretariat and the different, whether it's media or campaigning advice or, how to do digital storytelling, that sort of stuff, they come in and they actually train the women. And so we're able to draw on the resources of the Secretariat, which often grassroots activist groups can't actually access. So it actually, while the departmentalisation of an organisation can be, and I hear you, like quite frustrating in this work, it also can be really quite helpful. And because we've a resource base that you ordinarily wouldn't have access to, particularly for women in the Global South. So yeah, this is quite, I think, a really invigorating aspect, even though, it can be really challenging to navigate.
No, totally. And I think like that was one of the best things that we saw in the Better Normal thing project, was the moment where we got to kind of going, okay, what are the influencing opportunities? And then being able to say, okay, well, we've got the whole federation that we can draw on. Let's talk to the New York liaison office, who are going to be, creating a side event for the UN General Assembly, and then having that conversation with them, and then being really excited about the project and what the girls' vision was and the recommendations that they come up with, and then being able to join those two up and say, okay, well, how do we co-create this side event? What do you want it to look like to the youth activists? And then really kind of being able to kind of change up the structure of the way that we would normally do things and present new ideas, as well as kind of being able to learn from the team there who've got, you know, decades of experience in doing that particular kind of lobbying work. And I think, you know, when you see those connections happening, that, like you say, kind of is difficult to do otherwise without kind of linking up individual activists and groups like the Youth Activist Network with an organisation like PLAN or APWRD that does have that kind of global reach. Yeah, it's pretty special when you get to see it in action.
Yeah, I think for APWLD, as an organization that supports a network of grassroots feminist, smaller organizations, right? So the FPAR we do is mainly through sub-granting, which means we are facilitating the administrative aspect of, you know, we're like the middle body that connects the money from the donor and channels it to the grassroots groups. So one of the biggest challenges would be that funding, access to funding and resources. And from the global aid pool of money, very, very little, like I think it's less, like 1% of it goes to women's human rights organizations. So the funding is quite limited. But at the same time, it's not that I think the sub-grant amounts were quite reasonable. It's not too high. Like, for example, the example I showed with Burmese Women's Union and in organizing and the massive work they've done, the sub-grant amount is $10,000 to $12,000 for 2 years. So that's pretty small in terms of the outcomes we can achieve, right? So it's not always also about money. There are these other aspects that are really important. The you know, culture of solidarity and accountability. These are the other non-monetary aspects that drive movement and activism often, right? But I think the translation from programmatic experience, having these multilingual groups and having enough resources for translation was a big challenge. Especially when it's a regional and you have all these grassroots groups talking in different languages. We have the trainings, but it's just like how much they absorb really depends on the, you know, the language barrier becomes a hindrance. And also, even if there is money available, because the work is so political, the nature of it, we cannot take corporate funding, for example, right? Because the work will challenge them. So the political alignment is another challenge for even seeking funding. Yeah. I wanted to ask Naomi, do you are there any challenges from your line of work?
Well, I think that like FPAR is unpredictable. It's evolving, you know, very much so. It's an iterative process rather than a really planned, structured process, which as an activist and as a community worker, I'm really comfortable with. You know, I sit fine with that. But often the structures of a university setting really are uncomfortable with that. You know, an ethics application that you submit before the project needs to be very clear about what the project's going to involve. Now, the way I navigate that in my FPAR projects is I often have to submit several ethics applications. So one might be for that initial co-design phase. It might be then an amendment later on when we actually, you know, change that approach. When we then decide about our research approach, I need to submit another ethics application and often then further amendments. So the structure of the way universities conceptualise research is very traditional, and when we're doing participatory and community-based research that's very much collective, with collective decision-making, that structure can often be, you know, quite just almost irritating. Like it doesn't really work well with, you know, the way that we do the work. Also, I find we have to be really flexible with FPAR because the context that we're working with are, you know, the communities, things happen, like, you know, Kate and I have been doing, and Trim, we've been involved in an FPAR project with young women in Fiji around climate change and the impacts on girls. And, you know, we were entering into our co-design phase and a cyclone happened and it set the project back by a few months. Now, in the world, that makes sense and that we understand that, but funding agreements are usually very strict to a particular time frame and, you know, we're expected to deliver the project in that time, but humans don't really work like that. And so we're always trying to navigate and get around some of the structural and almost sometimes unnecessary constraints that we put upon ourselves or that funders put upon us. And so there's a lot of negotiation and, you know, staying true to the methodology and pushing back against these structures. And having to really, you know, argue the case for why a project needs to be extended or why it's taken a different route than what was originally planned, because we're working with communities and communities lead what they want to be doing because this is their research and their action. So again, I'm always comfortable with this stuff, but I'm often in the context that isn't. So we're having to, you know, be activists within the university as well to challenge these structures that actually make it sometimes hard to do what I think is really important ways of doing research.
Yeah, if I may jump in, it reminds me that COVID, you've given cyclone as an example, but you know, I think COVID taught us a lesson that we have to be flexible and we have to readjust our entire lifestyle because of this crisis, right? So we cannot ignore the other crises like the climate crisis or multiple forms of crisis that happen in women's lives and the grassroots communities face on a regular basis. But it also reminds me of one project that I was doing at ActionAid India, where we were working with urban young women in settlements, urban settlements. And so COVID happened in the middle of doing an FPAR. And their FPAR was around labor rights, and they wanted to influence the domestic law on, a lot of them worked as domestic workers, so they wanted to influence those laws to get minimum wage and so on. And because of the flexible nature of the action reflection cycle that we could apply in the methodology, we changed the whole, you know, whole FPAR project, and we were able to complete it within the timeline. But we shifted the goal, we shifted the process. It had to be online, and their immediate needs were around the COVID challenges. So they decided to document that because that was more, that received more priority in their, you know. So I think it also has, that flexibility is really important. Yeah.
I think there's also something quite important for us to think about, which is activism is a dangerous and risky thing sometimes. And, you know, that when we're working as academics and we're working and through as grassroots organisations, when we're as peak bodies and organisations like APWD and Plan, when we are trying to support women to mobilise and to organise to take action for their human rights, that in many contexts is actually a very dangerous thing to do. And we know about, you know, for example, that 1 or 2 people a week are murdered for environmental activism, and you know, assassinations are occurring all the time, and there are threats on women and so on. And this is a really tricky part, I think, to navigate in FPAR. I'm interested for both of you, Kate and Trim, what's it like navigating some of these? What are some of the ethical challenges in engaging with FPAR, thinking about the fact that activism is actually, you know, often very risky? Maybe Kate, have you got some thoughts around that with girls and young women?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the biggest ones that comes to mind is working. So, you know, if we're working with young people in particular, say between the ages of 10 and 19, generally speaking, well, in pretty much all of those cases, we need the assent of parents or guardians. So there's really a process of working not just with the young person to kind of say, okay, you know, you're not just co-researched in this process, but you've also got this opportunity to be an advocate for change. Like, what does that mean and look like for you? What do you want it to be? What skills do you want to develop? Like, there's all of these really exciting things to talk through with them about what they want that process and an opportunity to be for them. But then their families have to be okay with that, and we need to work with them to make sure that there is a shared understanding of what they're signing up for and what they want to be, what their child or young person wants to be doing and whether they're okay with that. So that's definitely one thing that we work through, and that's kind of done in a number of ways, but mostly through having a really, we talked about free, prior and informed consent as one of the key principles. And so having a session at the very beginning of the project where we would be bringing together not just the co-researchers, but also their parents or guardians, so that we can talk through what this is, and having those kind of regular check-ins throughout the whole process as well, and particularly as things develop and evolve, is just really, really crucial. And I think within that, there's been an interesting discussion with some of the programs teams where they're doing community development projects looking at, say, what the community's perspective on girls' leadership is. Like, is there a role for girls as leaders? Like, what does that mean? What does it change in terms of community structures and norms, behaviours, all of the things? So linking the work up with that as well has been really effective, and being able to work with communities as there is an FPAR focusing on girls and young women to say, what implications does this have for broader community change as well as structural change?
Yeah, I think in my experience, one of the ethical challenges, I would say, like, women don't have time, especially grassroots women, marginalized women, they really don't have time. They're busy. They have to, and they are double burdened with the domestic and care work they have to do. They have to work full time to, meet their family's needs. And on top of that, when you enroll them in the FPAR, which is not really a paid job, right, but requires time, that becomes, that could be a burden. So that's something we always need to take into consideration, that activism is also work. And are we adding more to the workload of the women already existing? They shouldn't be in that condition in the first place. And then now it is their responsibility to also change policies. So are we adding more responsibility and more burden on the women? So that's always, I think that's an ethical dilemma for me. And when you say, like, we are talking about, like, shifting power, challenging power, but challenging power is a very dangerous task. In when you are working with very powerless women and you are asking them to organize and take their power back, often they have to face these men who are in positions of power, right? Policy change means you have to go speak to these government officials, and these are just domestic workers, and this guy normally wouldn't even speak to them. So sometimes that's a common challenge where the community, the women would receive resistance from men, not just the officials, but also from family, that the husbands or the father, they wouldn't be happy, because in some cultures also women's mobility is restricted, right? And when you train them and they have this feminist consciousness, it's difficult. And we have even seen that gender-based violence is quite normalized in some places, and it's just very difficult when women just go, oh no, this is normal. Oh, like somebody got arrested or somebody got shot, or there was an event of honor killing. It's just very difficult to accept that as normal, as we do the work through FPAR. It's high risky, ethical. Yeah, so we have some really interesting questions in the in the chat box, and I'm so glad, because these two questions are that I have been asking myself. So the first question is by Lucimara Fornari. How are interventions evaluated? I think it's a very good question. How do we evaluate the interventions? If I can hear from Kate first, and then Naomi, maybe.
Sure. So I guess there's two parts perhaps for us. So one is evaluating throughout the process, where that's more a process where, as the full group of co-researchers, we're checking in on where is this going, how are we feeling about it, is it meeting the objectives that we want it to, is it adhering to the values and principles. So there's that kind of ongoing iterative evaluation, I guess maybe mainly as part of the reflection part of that research cycle. And then we have done end of project evaluations for the 3 FPARs we've done so far. And that has been a more formalized kind of, consultant doing an evaluation type process. And we're exploring at the moment what that might look like integrated into the FPAR cycle. And then the final one, is also that we're looking at doing like a meta evaluation across all of them. So once we've got maybe 4 finished, seeing how have they evolved, what have we learned from them, what's been the impact, and so on. Yeah. How about you, Naomi?
Yeah, definitely. Because of the cyclical process of FPAR, the planning, acting, observing, reflecting, we're constantly reflecting. So we're constantly, like we're saying, monitoring or evaluating the work that we're doing, its impact, its effectiveness, what needs to change, and so on. So it's very much iterative and engaged in the process. I've been involved with APWD's FPAR work for a number of years now, and along with Trim and a few others, we led, or I guess facilitated or supported, a participatory evaluation of APWD's climate justice FPAR program. So we used an FPAR methodology to evaluate the FPAR program. So there was a lot of FPAR happening. And that evaluation, we used the APWD theory of change as, I guess, the parameters or the framework for the evaluation. So that gave us the areas by which we were wanting to evaluate, to look at the impacts and the outcomes of the program. But the way we did the evaluation was very much participatory. So we designed the evaluation together. At each stage of the project and each of those trainings, we were collecting data and we were doing reflective processes. And then in the final reflection meeting of the 2-year program, we then had basically a participatory evaluation workshop. So over 2 days, we were sharing experiences from the field, bringing data from our communities about the impact of the work, and then also collectively analysing that to determine together what were the impacts of this FPAR program, what were the learnings, and what changes would we need in the future. That research has actually been published in a paper in Gender and Development at the end of last year, and I'll post it in the chat, the link, because it really spells out both the evaluation process and the findings and the outcomes of doing this work through the 2-year program. So I think it's quite a helpful reference for people if you'd like to learn a bit more about, how we actually might consider understanding the impacts of FPAR, because of course, if it doesn't actually have an impact, then, it's just, it can well just be another form of research that's not particularly effective. So the evaluation was really important for us in that process. So I'll post the citation in the chat so people can access that paper later.
Yeah, I think the monitoring and evaluation plan has to be part of the FPAR, and in this case, we had that from the beginning. So throughout the timeline, we had the evaluation questions and we followed up. And of course, in the APWD, the 4th meeting is called the reflection evaluation meeting, where the participants, all of them come, and we even invite women from the community if they can come to evaluate their own FPAR. The second question is also very, very interesting. It's from Yvonne Cabral. Forgive me if I'm pronouncing your names wrong. We can see how social justice and knowledge construction go together. I was wondering how to assure sustainability of the women empowerment after the end of the project. Can you give us some more information about follow-up changes? So maybe we can hear from Naomi quickly, and then Kate. I'm conscious of time. We have 5 minutes. Yeah.
So I think it's really important that we think about FPAR as a process rather than arriving somewhere. And so the whole process of FPAR is really about collectively building our knowledge, our capacity, our skills, our confidence to demand change and to bring about the change that we, the human rights, the women's human rights that we're aiming for. And so while a formal FPAR project that might involve external stakeholders might be a part of that, what we're really trying to do is collectively build movements that can sustain. And so the whole way through, it's about supporting activists to feel like they can tackle and take on their activism with the skills and capacities that they need. And it is a challenge. Like, you know, often they'll have, for example, they'll be part of a 2-year program and they'll have a lot of institutional support. And then when the project itself officially is over, they're, you know, they don't have that level of support. Except that's not particularly the case, because firstly, they've now connected with, through this process, they've connected with a whole range of stakeholders, they've built a whole range of relationships and skills, and they now have a network, and particularly through the APWLD program, a network of other activists that they can work with. So they've built a bigger movement than what they had previously. Also, I think it's really important that the FPAR process thinks about future planning. So because we're doing the Plan, Act, Observe, Reflect cycle the whole way through, we're constantly planning for our next phase. And so while the official kind of engagement of the academic or the kind of donor organisation might be for a short period of time, what's really important is that we don't finish on the report. We actually need to conclude on not only implementation of activism, but then also supporting women to plan their next stages and for them to feel like they have a pathway forward and that they know where they are heading. And that there's if the partner or the academic is going to step away, that the time is ready for that. If that happens prematurely, then I think the movement, you know, might be quite affected and may not be able to continue with the work that effectively, or, you know, they may it might finish up in that period of time. So there's definitely some collective work that's needed to make that transition appropriate. What about you, Kate? Do you have any thoughts around that too?
I couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah. No, that was perfect. I mean, I completely agree. I think that's very, very similar from an NGO perspective, as well as just kind of saying, okay, how much discrete funding can we provide? What does the kind of institutionalized support aspect of this project look like? Often it's kind of 1 to 2 years. If we can make it a program, potentially up to 5 years. But yeah, being able to have those discussions along the way, doing that future planning, the succession planning stuff, but also recognizing that skills building and just kind of saying, you know, now there's this whole network of youth activists that we've worked with on these different projects who've got all of their action projects and they're ongoing and they start to lead those. So yeah, just basically agreeing with everything Naomi has said.
Yeah, me too. I think Naomi covered everything. But in our work also, I think the goal is to equip these women with enough tools, skills, resources, network, and empower them to the point where they don't have to rely on us to, you know, give them funding, because they become empowered to get that themselves. We also have donor roundtables, and we connect them with our donor groups, because once they become skilled and equipped, then the donors are interested to fund them too. So often donors also approach us asking, oh, you know, we are looking to support, and then we would just connect them. That helps. But there is not enough systematic support, I think. We need to find more funding for women's human rights work in general. So thanks to everyone. Thank you for participating. So I'm sharing our contact information once more. So we have to end now. We're out of time. So please feel free to write to us, reach out to us. And it's been a great pleasure to be part of this panel. And thanks to Kate and thanks to Naomi.
Thank you, everyone. And I've just posted that.
Thanks, everyone.
I've just posted 2 links to papers that might be helpful for people if they would like to read more. Thanks, everyone.